Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm so excited and honored to be here today with a lovely group of panelists. And we are really fortunate for their time and expertise today. So I hope to have a really great conversation with everyone. Today's event is part of the Global Voices series, a series of 3 events from the Feminist Theory and Gender Studies section of ISA. And in this event, which is titled Sex Workers' Rights as Human Rights, a conversation on International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers, we seek to discuss the ways that D17, which is today, has been used to bring attention to the compounding criminality and violence that sex workers experience. And also to talk about the ways, though, that sex workers themselves are combating these harmful narratives and also the material violence we experience, and think about ways that we mobilize for community care and for our well-being. So there's more information on the Feminist Theory and Gender Studies page of ISA about the series of seminars, which speaks to essentially the genocidal or the ways that the state excludes and dispossesses people. So of course, sex workers are a community that experiences that in various ways, and today we can make space for that conversation. We have 3 wonderful speakers who joined us today, Patti Morales, Ashley Madness, and Kim Soriano. So I want to first introduce myself and then introduce our panelists, and then we can get started. We'll have a Q&A session towards the end of our event today, which is set to go for an hour and a half, and we shall see how the conversation flows. But if you have any questions that emerge throughout our session, please do feel free to drop them in the chat, anything that comes up for you as we speak. So my name is Alisson Rowland. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of California, Irvine, and I've also been organizing with SWOPLA for a little over a year now. And I'm really excited to be doing this event today because it's both personally and professionally important to me. So I'm excited to get started. So we have Patti Morales, who is the program officer of the Sex Worker Giving Circle at Third Wave Fund, which is a participatory grant-making program that has awarded over $3 million in funding since 2018 to sex worker movement organizations throughout the country. Having worked in the sex trade for close to a decade and studied sex work in graduate school, she's now shifted her efforts to the field of philanthropy, where she helps ensure that sex workers take up all the seats at the funding decision-making table. Thank you so much, Patti. And we have Ashley Madness, who is a transgender sex worker organizer based in Los Angeles. Since 2019, she has served on the steering committee of Sex Workers Outreach Project Los Angeles, and has also served on the steering committee of Decrim Sex Work California since the coalition's first election in 2020. She spearheaded the SWOPLA COVID-19 Emergency Relief Fund and helped lead Decrim Sex Work California's repeal of the law that criminalized loitering for purposes of committing prostitution in California, which led to over 10,000 people's records being automatically cleared of that offense in LA County alone. Ashley has helped sex workers and allies raise over $2 million since 2022 for sex worker-led, POC-led, and trans-led initiatives and grassroots organizations. Thank you so much, Ashley. And then we have Kim Soriano, who is a community-based member on Tongva lands and has organized over the past 15 years on issues related to gentrification and policing. She began organizing with sex workers during the Super Bowl LV1 hosted in LA in 2022, and the resulting increased policing at the local and federal level. She is a postdoctoral fellow at Southern California Library, focusing on creating spaces for street-based workers in Figueroa Boulevard. Thank you so much, Kim, and for all of you for joining us today and for lending your expertise and experience. I'm really excited to get started with this conversation. So I think to get into it, we need to talk about what D17 is. What is this event that we're hosting? What are we hoping to bring attention to? So hopefully people saw in the event description that D17 seeks to commemorate the lives lost in 2003 to a serial killer whose name I don't feel like deserves attention, but you can find information online. And at the time, the violence sex workers experience was not highlighted to the extent it is today, which it's still highlighted very little today. And so the day was created by SWOP USA in order to bring attention to that and also to build community-centered spaces to mourn together and to build together. So it's both a commemorative moment and it's also a call to action on the part of sex workers and allies to support the rights and well-being of sex workers. And so today we have this lovely event to kind of bring light to both the violences, interpersonally and state inflicted, as well as the opportunities for community and the ways that the community has mobilized to protect each other and to protect other people. So with that being said, I would like to hear from our panelists how they're understanding the main issues that face sex workers today. What do you see as kind of the driving forces behind the violence that sex workers experience?
I can start us off. I think for me, a lot of this, sort of the main issues facing the sex worker rights movement is really thinking about how diverse sex workers are in the movement and how we're not a monolith. And with that, right, we bring in our own politics and our own experiences and commitments that aren't always in harmony with each other. So I think a lot about some of the overlaps between the policing of space from unhoused people who, a lot of folks participate in sex work when they're unhoused, especially femmes and trans people. And I think about the overlapping violences that happen when you occupy those intersections of being unhoused, being of color, being trans and queer, and how, yeah, sometimes those aren't necessarily the issues at the forefront of the sex worker movement, right? I also think about the violence that is the label of no humans involved, which was used by LAPD when sex workers were murdered, and how even the title of today's panel, right, sex worker rights as human rights, really makes me think and question who do we consider human, even within the sex worker right movements. Yeah,
I think that's all totally, that's a very important and makes sense to be thinking about that because of the work we do every day within the movement. But first, for anybody new to the table, I would start with things being fucked up generally, and then add criminalization and stigma, and maybe that's the backwards order. But between um, all of the other things in this country or this world that are oppressing people, sex workers are always oppressed by that too, right? Because we don't only exist as sex workers, we're also full humans in whatever contexts. And so if the rent is too damn high, the rent is too damn high for sex workers. And so that kind of plays into how white supremacist systems and imperialism are very bad for sex workers. And sometimes, like Gavin Newsom embracing the Supreme Court's permission to criminalize the houseless, the number one human rights violation in the state is the number one human rights violation for sex workers. It's all kind of related. Specifically, sex workers are criminalized pretty widely for being sex workers, and in a lot of places, association with sex workers is criminalized in various ways. And between those two things, sex workers can be very isolated and experience a lot of stigma for doing sex work. Or maybe on top of that, separately, there's a stigma for doing sex work because of cultural reasons. But a couple of things that I do see really recurrently with all kinds of sex workers are the interaction with criminalization and stigma being a big issue. Whenever stigma always, and then criminalization whenever that's coming at you is pretty brutal. So I wanted to lay those out there too. Yeah, thank you, Kim, for getting us started in a deep place.
Thank you, Ashley, for naming criminalization and stigma, because I feel like those are always just like at the top of like the fucked tree that just kind of like impacts everything. Also just want to express gratitude for having me here. You know, this day in particular is a little bit hard just because it's a day of mourning, a day of grieving. And just like a couple weeks ago, we've lost the third person connected to the sex worker giving circle where I work. And I just want to like give them a shout out, take a moment to acknowledge them. His name is Johnny Walden. We also have Yuvia Bayo and Cecilia Gentili, who you might be familiar with. But Johnny Walden is one of the advisors of the sex worker giving circle this year. And not only do I want to like honor and recognize them, but want to like kick off the conversation with this because the violence is just like never ending. The loss of life is, always haunting us. And at the same time, though, I'm so grateful to be here and have this conversation because this is kind of the stuff that like keeps us moving and keeps us in the fight. Like a moment to acknowledge and name like whore power, hooker liberation, that like, and just the energy and effort that like sustains us. And so, fighting for people who are still like with us, thankfully, and also like in honor of those that we've lost. So, and also Johnny Walden ran Comms for Black and Pink, which is a prison abolition organization that supports queer and HIV positive folks. And so, yeah, I just want to start with just like honoring community members. But also I, as the program officer of the Sex Worker Giving Circle and working in like philanthropy, I am hoping that I can add like a funder's perspective to today's conversation. And so in addition to criminalization, stigma, like state violence, economic and social barriers, I think for us in the funding landscape, one of the ongoing issues is like the lack of funding, just like I think the number of like how much like philanthropy money or donations annually go to sex worker funding, it's like 0.0000 like 8-9%. And although we're proud of having hit that like 3 million mark as far as like our program goes with like moving money to sex worker movement organizations, when you consider that philanthropy and donations are like a billion, like hundreds of billions of dollars are given every year. 3 or 4 million is like, it's like barely giving pennies. So yeah, and I think some of the other questions will lead into like why people are afraid to fund sex work. Like for example, like it's conflation with sex trafficking, the stigma and everything else. But when it's time to actually move money to organizations, it's not enough. And so that's like scarcity in funding to actually help support all of the movement strategies like mutual aid, advocacy, cultural work, policy change. All of that requires resources. And so the lack of funding like also contributes to the violence.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Patti, for honoring and commemorating the lives lost. I'm so sorry to hear about that, but thank you for highlighting the work that they've done. There are quite a few threads that everyone has brought up that I would love to follow up on, and they're all interrelated, unsurprisingly. So Ashley's mention of criminalization and stigma, I'd like to highlight something that she said about the state being one of the primary, if not the primary, inflictor of human rights violations against sex workers. And Kim really brought into focus some of the specificity of those intersections, how the state can enact violence against sex workers, against homeless people, against people of color, all affecting overlapping communities. And another thing that they mentioned was specific designations of humanness. So no human involved in cases of where there were sex workers harmed. And we've seen really graphic images on social media, online, very spectacularized death of sex workers, of people of color, of trans and gender nonconforming people, and the ways that that spectacularization is used to dehumanize further. And then finally, there's sex trafficking, which unfortunately you just cannot get around in conversations of sex work. You have to address that kind of elephant in the room. So I'm wondering if anybody would like to speak to a little bit more on how these intersections play out in both the policy realm and then for Pati in the funding realm in terms of, you know, policies that are intended to address homelessness, address, you know, trans rights, gender nonconforming rights, etc., and how those can actually be weaponized against sex workers. And if anybody wants to tackle the conversation of human trafficking and how that has manifested in the United States or beyond, I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can follow up a little bit on the funding and sex trafficking connection to it. Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, Allison, like it just doesn't matter like how loud we shout this out, like the conflation just continues to like haunt us. And I think now even more than ever with like anti-Palestinian efforts, anti-abortion efforts, organizations and like funding organizations are like like the anxiety is like up, you know, out the roof. Like Third Wave Fund specifically, where I work or where the Giving Circle is housed, like has made it on a couple of lists of like who is funding like anti-Israel efforts, right? And I think it's only a matter of time before we make it on like who is funding like abortion efforts. And we're also already being asked to like change sex work language in our grant reporting and our grant dockets. And I think like at the root of that is this conflation between sex trafficking and sex work. And I think when people think about like donating money to the sex worker movement, the concern is that they're like funding sex trafficking, right? And, you know, I mean, we can have just like one entire like seminar or talk just on like why that conflation is so problematic, but just to like generally name that it really like, you know, one issue with it is that it kind of removes us from the actual exploitation of capitalism that like affects all workers, not just sex work. And so to kind of like root it in this like trafficking realm, like actually removes us from the root of the problem, again, that like all workers experience. And also the fact that like people use sex work as a tool to navigate capitalism. And so it's not so much that like sex work is necessarily empowering just as much as any other job, but that it's a tool for people to like make it another day, like pay their bills or what, or, you know, survive. And so what happens when it's conflated with trafficking, you know, such like the big law that happened in 2018, which is actually what led to the creation of the sex worker giving circle, is FOSTA SESTA. And since then, like a bunch of laws have now like are in the, you know, have passed or in the round or we've had to fight against. Sorry, let me look at my notes to make sure I'm not right. And so these legislations end up eroding safety mechanisms, including online platforms. Like FOSTA SESTA removed so many of us from the internet. Like to this day, like we have bans that directly are banned from several platforms that directly relate to that legislation. And so, yeah, what ends up like, and it doesn't mean that like sex trafficking, like sex workers are also, sorry, my dog. Sex workers and survivors of the sex trade are not like at odds with each other. Like we're all kind of fighting like a similar battle. So just want to name too that we're also like not in opposition of each other's liberation. It's just that when you conflate the two movements, it's not actually like one exposing the root problems, and two, it's creating like even more like violence because safety, mechanisms for safety are like completely eroded by these legislations. So
To hop off of that, a little bit into why the discussion is so you always have to talk about it is kind of simply the business model of an anti-trafficking organization. Like if like when anti-sex work laws and anti-trafficking organizations first started in the turn of the 1900s or so, it's the cops in the churches teaming up. They think that all the sex workers are clearly destitute in some kind of way. They're morally bankrupt, and somebody's got to do something about them. And if you are able to say that you've been trafficked, so that you can kind of get a better arrest, is how this is how the system works these days, at least. You don't have to do your prostitution charge. So you arrest all the sex workers, and then whoever is able to say, oh, that's somebody who I can say something about, that can get you to arrest them as one of the big bad traffickers, and you can save me. Then you get access into all the program that the anti-trafficking org has funding to do. And so these organizations usually have a large fraction of their budget dedicated to budget advocacy specifically. You know, you're spending 10 or 20% of all the dollars coming in talking to the government and your donors and your voters to try to keep the money flowing. And then on top of that, 100% of their clients typically come directly from the police. And so keeping the cops saying that this is a good program is a huge part of your advocacy strategy. And there's kind of no room in that model to say maybe arresting everybody doing it consensually is a bad way to figure out who's not doing it consensually. Because if you arrest everybody who's doing sex work, then you create this environment where it's impossible to do it because of capitalism reasons without taking this huge risk. You're trapping people in cycles of poverty. But guess what? That ends up filling the prisons, keeping the cops on the payroll, and kind of working out for this cycle of incarceration that has been built on this industry. So it's a part of the prison industrial complex, the specific anti-trafficking industrial complex. And to go to the money, there was a report in like 2018. So in 2018 or 2017, like before FOSTA SESTA, 2018 was when the report came out. It was, I think the total amount that year of all the philanthropy money that went towards sex worker organizing in the United States was $2 million. So since 2018, both me and Pati have like matched that. So hopefully if they did the numbers again, it's a whole different world. But the fact of the matter is, like, if you are a sex worker, you're not doing sex work not for money. You know, you're not doing it because you don't have material needs. So in terms of a population to be organizing and working with, there's one thing that is a commonality between all the sex workers. You are willing to exchange a sexual service for something of value. So we all need shit, basically. So not having that money there definitely makes it harder to organize. And if you compare that 2 million in 2018 for the US from all the big philanthropy monies to anti-trafficking funds, $2 million funds like a relatively small anti-trafficking nonprofit that you've never heard of. It does not account for a drop in the bucket of California's anti-trafficking money. Maybe it would be Maine's anti-trafficking money for the year. But the amount of funds available for serving people who say they've been trafficked because they have are able to help the cops in some kind of way, or maybe it's easier to get access to the program. But that's how you justify the funding. There's tons of money towards that, and therefore towards advocating for that kind of perception of how trafficking laws work. And the money's just not there in terms of the sex worker organizing side. And part of that is also because if you're more than one sex worker working together to help you out, and all sex is sex trafficking, you know, any two sex workers are now trafficking each other. And as an organizational level, like at SWOPLA, we definitely have to be very careful to make sure everything we're doing is very above board, because somebody with the wrong perspective could interpret or finds the worst possible looking evidence and launch an investigation that makes it impossible to function, even if they can't get you for anything. Could interpret any kind of sex worker organizing as trafficking, basically, with a couple of extra steps, right? And so because of that, even though sex workers make money nationwide, worldwide. It can be very, very hard to have the kind of political power that you might expect a population that might be like 1% of the population or something. And we also obviously, because of criminalization, we're not loudly broadcasting our business. We're not. Sometimes we do get to go to a sex worker thing like this December 17th event, or that SWOPLA hosts, or community orgs. But it's very difficult. We can't all meet up at the we can't hand flyers out at the door of the factory before everybody clocks in, because we got the protected right to unionize, right? Like that's just not how any of sex worker organizing works. So it can be a tough field to move. And then I just wanted to mention some specifics on the money side of things that totally affects the discourse, whether we kind of, think about just the amount of money sex workers spend on advocating our side versus the trafficking side, and then the cop side on top of that. It's no wonder it always has to come up.
And just sort of, I hate to say it, piggybacking off of that. I really liked your question about how policies end up being used against sex workers, and it reminds me a lot of how like the weaponizing of the Disabilities Act is being used to conduct sweeps of unhoused people, under the argument, right, that they're blocking sidewalk space, even though most unhoused people are disabled. And also just the way that the state views safety is just incompatible with some people who are trying to make safety outside of the carceral state, right? So I think a lot about all the money that gets redirected in the city, right? Because specific people in city council, at least in LA, push for the funding to go to combat human trafficking, right? But there's no clear indication of what they're doing, where that money is going, how they're doing it. And in LA, at least what that looks like is everybody gets, right, criminalized. They like to say, right, we don't arrest people who are doing this consensually, but they do, and they put out their names. Every time there's a sting, right, there's a list of people who are arrested. And almost always it's, buyers who are probably immigrants, brown and Black men, and also just reminds me of the White Slavery Act and this panic over white women being right, the new slaves, which was heavily tied to anti-immigration legislation in the US. And sort of all these legislations that exist, like the venereal health stuff that popped out just to police and track sex workers. And it, right, doesn't happen just in the US, it happens all over. Juana Maria Rodriguez just came out with a book where she looks at the Mexican registry of sex workers, right, where they needed to have a picture and sort of who they were on this like state book. And that's really terrifying, right, for the state to have a whole catalog of sex workers in the area. And unfortunately, right, that's something real that's happening every time I go to Tijuana to visit a family member, right? I'm scared that I'm not gonna be let back in. I'm like, they found my site, they found my stuff. This is it. And just the way that the US and most other Western societies are like heavily based on enslavement and genocide of indigenous people, and the continuation of that, like the construction of deviance and how that's always tied back to an over-sexual person of color, right? And this sort of, it's like a limitation of imaginary, right? That people can't have their own sexualities, that people can't enjoy being a sex worker, or that even, not even if you enjoy it, right? Because I hate work, period. But it's just, why would I want to drive for Lyft, right, and get $200 after working for 12 hours when I could get something similar at a very different hourly wage. And going along with what Pati said, right? Sex workers are almost always having to love their job. And there's this obligation, right, from us to have to love our job, or else we're seen as super oppressed and super exploited, right? We can't just be. We can't just be in existence, right, and working. We have to either love it or be forcibly victimized to escape criminalization or carcerality. Um, and just on, I guess, how the state views human trafficking is really wild, especially when you get to know the different scenarios that are happening on the ground and what gets classified as pimping and pandering, right? Someone's pimp can literally be their brother who's trying to help with security, right? But now is automatically seen as someone who is trafficking your sister. Similarly, when folks are trying to provide security for each other, they could be considered, how Ashley was saying, pimping and pandering, even though there is no real like traveling trafficking going on. Which is really scary, especially when you're trying to build mutual aid networks. There's a lot of risks that sex workers take, and I think I'm always really amazed at sort of our strength and power, and it's always really, I want to say inspiring to me, but it's always really interesting because when you tell someone you're a sex worker, they're usually like, oh my God, like, I'm so sorry. I'm just like, I've gained all this community, I've gained different ways of existing, different ways of like loving myself, different ways of valuing different things, that go beyond the the sorry, poor you. And this, I felt this especially because I recently saw Honora in theaters, and I think a lot of things need to be gatekept, and that was something that I would only want to watch, right, with a sex worker audience and not a civvy audience. Like at the end of the film, someone was like, "Oh, she's crying because she has to be a prostitute again," and it was just wild. The civvy imagination to me is very wild, right? Because there's no nuance. There's only victimization or the super multimillionaire sex worker, right? Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you so much, y'all. I feel like the conversation covered a lot of breadth, and for people who maybe are not living in this in the same way or familiar with these same conversations, it might be hard to see the connections here. But in terms of what y'all have brought up about the conflation of trafficking, these narratives of the happy whore or the the perfect victim, these things are present regardless of whether you're actually a sex worker or not.
They do tie into the trafficking thing, like, or criminalization 1-to-1, right? Because you're either in the stereotype, you're either a happy whore, as in you're like, you would be having like maybe sex with these guys anyway, and then you're also making millions of dollars on top of it, basically for nothing. Like, you're drastically overpaid and luxurious bourgeoisie, not a real working class job kind of a thing. Where on the other hand, if you are forced into this, you didn't really have agency, it's terrible, and you're destitute, that's an excuse to rescue you. So if you have that dichotomy as an understanding, the arrest is always justified. You're either like, well, all right, well, this person who gets to enjoy her life of just selling pussy has to deal with the inconvenience of the arrest, but she was kind of, leeching off the system with those, taking all those hardworking men's jobs, or money or whatever. Or on the other hand, if that's like your thought of your collateral consequence, then it's worth arresting them in order to save all those destitute poor folks. So that's they totally tie 1-to-1 in terms of how that narrative has been supported by and is kind of is part of the anti-trafficking hysteria conflation criminalizing sex work, like on the policy side too. And I'm not a lot of actors are political actors as well as cultural actors as well as financial actors, maybe us included. So totally can draw that link for you. Yeah,
Thank you,
to be
Ash.
very shallow about it, but
Yeah, no, exactly. And I appreciate that connection that you drew. And something that struck me about this connection, about these narratives that we have, that we see weaponized in policy to deny funding, to deny resources, is both the exceptionalness of sex work and it's very mundane and everyday, right? For most sex workers, it is the mundane. For most police, law enforcement, civilians, etc., it is exceptional, right? Like you wouldn't be arrested for driving Lyft. You wouldn't be arrested for teaching at your local community college, but you will be arrested for engaging in sex work. And even though, as Pati mentioned, for pretty much everybody engaging in it, it's a form of survivor work and or a way to access capital to make money. Like that's usually why people are engaging in sex work, when they're engaging in it consensually, right? It's what makes sex work. So I'm curious to hear more about some of the things that you all mentioned in terms of how sex work becomes linked, or what are the links between sex work and something that Pati mentioned about pro-Israel, pro-abortion movements, in terms of like those links are made, whether the organization, the people are making them themselves or not. And some sex workers are explicitly making those links and some aren't. So how are the sex work kind of become exceptionalized in this way? And also in terms of thinking about state violence, thinking about capitalism, why do people have beef with sex workers? Why is the violence continuing to be perpetrated against sex workers as a specific community?
Yeah, I can follow up on that, just to name that, like, first of all, like sex workers are parents too. And so in the way that like reproductive justice affects everyone, like sex workers are not excluded from that. But also like the nature of the job like puts you at higher risk of like unwanted pregnancies. And so for that reason alone, like restorative reproductive justice is a big deal to the sex worker community. But also to follow up on Kim bringing up on house people and how like housing instability pushes many into sex worker for survival. Also migrants, like discriminatory employment laws, xenophobia and anti-immigrant policies, which also affect like disabled people, including like neurodivergent disabled people. It's incredibly difficult to find a job. Like neurodivergency and like 9 to 5 just does not align. And so for in the same way that we think about like disability is like, if you don't already like see yourself as disabled by either like particular systems or like having a physical disability, we understand that like aging alone, like disability is waiting for like everyone. And so in that same way, like all of our struggles are connected. Same with queer and trans people. Sex work has historically provided income and community for trans and queer individuals facing employment discrimination. Black and brown sex workers are disproportionately profiled, criminalized, and exposed to violence. And so sex workers have always been like a part of collective liberation struggles, whether like it's known or not, because we know about, or I guess some of us know about Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson with Stonewall. Not everyone though, because I remember the Stonewall movie came out and it was like white men, LOL. But really it was like sex workers leading the Stonewall riots, right? But also like Malcolm X, Maya Angelou. And yeah, sex workers organize across issues because the violence and discrimination we face cross-cuts oppression. And every community's liberation is bound up with one another. Right. Yeah. I mean, unsurprisingly. And it like mainstream media, like will just only promote like myths and lies about that. So But yeah, sex worker organizers in the US are on the front lines of struggles for migrant justice, Black, Indigenous, people of color liberation, bodily autonomy, gender justice, end to prisons and policing. But the work continues to be under-recognized and even more underfunded.
Yeah, and just to go off on what Pati beautifully said, like I was before I came into sex worker organizing, I was really into anti-carceral organizing, which is really interesting now because the term abolition is used in both spaces very differently. Uh, so when I say abolition, I mean anti-carcerality, not abolition of sex work. And it was the same issues, right? There was no understanding that sex workers are usually leading the fight against police and against carceral violence because of the way that it directly impacts us in very unique and intersecting ways, right? Through gender, through race, through disability. And also, if you want to unpack it even more, right, our physical presence in public space, like within sex work, all of us are criminalized to a certain extent, right? But some of us, right, some sex work is illegal and some sex work isn't. When I think about like stripping, for example, right? And although a lot of these things overlap, there's different precarity, right? To someone who does like only online work versus full service in person. And something that really stood out to me, Pati, that you mentioned is bodily autonomy and the way that I see, right, sex workers really prioritize bodily autonomy, and what does that look like and what does that require for us to have bodily autonomy is the destruction of the state, right? Because the state is always imposing, and that not to everyone, right? But if you're gendered, if you're racialized, right, the state will impose on you in terms of your bodily autonomy. And your question about Palestine, Alisson, really made me think about this exceptionalism of violence when it comes to the US. Like the US is or portrays itself, right, as this place of freedom and free of like isms and free of violence, right? And when they see or when they try to justify violence against Palestinian people, it's always under this exceptionalism that, right, the US as a Christian nation knows better. And like I remember seeing this one tweet that really upset me, and it was a sex worker saying, "Why should I care about Palestine? If I suck dick over there, I'll get stoned," or something, right? And this is reiterating really racist and xenophobic sentiments about Palestinians, but also about religion, right? As if there wasn't any sex workers in Palestine, as if there wasn't any queer people in Palestine, right? And we know that there is, and sex workers are everywhere. So it's this similar narrative, right, that the US always wants to rescue women and children, even when they're rescuing, right, comes in extremely violent forms, in occupying forms, very similar sentiments that we get in South Central LA, right, where police are an occupying force. So I see a lot of these parallels, and I think it's very interesting how the fascist right is organized and is intentional in how they see ourselves linking together, right, through bodily autonomy, through the fight for Palestine, through the fight for sex workers, and it's obviously a threat, right, to the state and a threat to hegemony and the status quo.
And on that one, I think one thing with sex workers maybe being pro-Palestine and anti-Israel's occupation, at least here in Los Angeles and probably lots of places in the world, the the cops here work directly with Israel to test stuff in each other's places, along with the U.S. military in, formerly in Afghanistan and other occupied holdings, to get away with shit that they can't do here yet. Like, they will test their technology by building it, giving it to Israel, and then if Israel can figure out how to make it work or make the tweaks so it still works in a way that you can sell it in America, they will then deploy that technology here. So in terms of, it's kind of like the opposite of the enemy of your enemy is your friend. Like, my enemies are the cops beating down my neck is kind of a universal proposition. And who do the cops beating down your neck ally with? Well, at least in the United States, they are very closely tied to the literal Israel military. So that's, our, if we're, if a, so at the, it's a very, it's not kind of just the theoretical, the amount of fascism happening in the world. They're very specific ties and collaborations that cause people who are invested in keeping lands occupied against the will of the people in various ways in working together. And which gets me to my economic theory or reason why sex work is criminalized. It's a threat to the status quo. Sex work has such low barriers to entry and has a lot of flexibility and is kind of inherently very difficult to monitor, because anywhere there's two people who, one of whom is horny and has money, like, there can be sex work happening with a sex worker. It's so easy to enter and to exit in a certain kind of way, and so difficult to monitor, control, centralize. And if it's an effective way to not just like have a job, but actually, not they're not really worried about more jobs paying minimum wage, because they already built that minimum wage system to be exploitative. If sex work is offering better working conditions to people, especially to people who otherwise can't even, compete in the economy for any job, then it's kind of a whole hole in their system where all these folks who have been marginalized and easy to control and continue to disenfranchise and underinvest in, they now have a way to get resources to fight for their causes. Sex workers contribute to queer liberation, or whatever the mutual aid community scene is in your local place. There are sex workers who are able to finance that work through their sex work. So having this kind of and unlike so having that really hard to control, surveil way to build resources and not just take care of yourself, but maybe create some kind of surplus, do something in the economy that otherwise would be totally inaccessible to you and a lot of other people like you. You've got kind of whole communities who are able to provide for themselves and take care of themselves and fight for better futures in a meaningful way compared to if they didn't have the sex work income available. So I think that's, yeah, to tie that together a little bit, maybe, to my answers.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing that. I think you had very robust answers to this question, right? Of, we know the state inflicts violence on sex workers. What is the incentive there to continue to do so? And it is, as you all mentioned, to varying degrees, the threat or the promise that sex workers have, that sex workers offer to people who have been marginalized, dispossessed, subject to the politics of disposability from the state, and the way the state seeks to exclude particular groups of people and communities, especially people of color, especially disabled people, right? So I think that sucks, obviously, and D17 is a day to mourn in community, so making space to talk about the ways that the state has failed us is so important. But I also want to use this space because I know all of you are really active, amazing members of the community. I want to hear a little bit more about, if you want to share more about the specific work that you do to advance sex worker rights and safety, or if you just want to share with people, scholars, organizers, activists, a regular civilian on the street, what they can do to show solidarity and support of sex workers.
I can go ahead. Is it okay to share a link in the chat, Allison? I think. Yeah, I just want to give a quick shout out to this collective of funders, which Sex Worker Giving Circle and Third Wave Fund is a part of, the Sex Worker Donor Collaborative. And this is a network of funders that advocates to increase the amount of funding and support that goes towards sex worker movements. I know Red Umbrella Fund is part of it, which they're based in Amsterdam and do like global open calls for their applications. Also Yuhai Eshri, which is based in Africa. So even in philanthropy, which, highly problematic, abolish philanthropy also, but we are working to organize folks who are already in the field to increase the funding that's going towards them. Also, just to give a little bit more detail into the specific work that we do at Sex Worker Giving Circle, it's a participatory grant making fund. So that means that we invite sex workers to make up the grant making panel, and they make all high level funding decisions about which orgs are going to get money. Even though I'm the program officer, my colleague CJ is a program associate. We just like facilitate and help run the program. We don't even get a say in like what orgs get grants every year. The grant making panel, which is made up of current or former sex workers, they make those decisions. And we also provide multi-year grants because 1 year of funding is not enough. Actually, 2 years of funding is also not enough. And so we're working to increase that number. And we make sure that our process is as low barrier as possible, making the application as easy as possible for organizations, and ensuring that the strategies that we fund are diverse and that include mutual aid, so that sex workers can share resources like housing, safety tips, healthcare, to mitigate systemic neglect and violence, but also like supporting decriminalization and policy change. And I think just to wrap things up about what folks can do, I realized I meant to say this earlier when I was talking about like, we're all just like one injury away from being like severely disabled. I feel like we're all just like one job firing away from like becoming a sex worker. And so just to like, and also the like worker solidarity again, that like really we're all exploited under capitalism, and just like keeping that connection in mind. But yeah, like educate yourself, advocate to the extent that you're able to, supporting mutual aid. On that note, let me do one more link drop if you do want to support our efforts and know that your donation is going straight to sex workers. Also today, to honor International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers, it's only a matter of like minutes before we release our grantee list this year. And so tune in to Third Wave Fund's Instagram, our website, and our newsletter, where we're going to make that announcement. If you also want to contribute directly to the organizations, that it would also be lovely and amazing. And Third Wave Fund also we fund like disability justice. We have like a disability justice specific fund. We have one for transformative justice. So we support a wide variety of movements if you did want to support through the organization. And also just respect and honor the expertise of sex workers. The community is just made up of so many like wonderful, amazing people who have extensive experience in the field, as lived experience as researchers, workers, and yeah, it can be as easy as listen to sex workers.
Sorry for the cat, but the tail came on screen, so I had to show her off. I can talk a little bit about SWOPLA. And first, so SWOPLA back in 2018 is when I first got involved. They had been doing their strolls along Figueroa Corridor and support groups, had kind of done a good job of getting themselves organized just before 2018, which turned out to be helpful when FOSTA-SESTA passed. that made 50% of sex worker, like Backpage.com was seized at the same time FOSTA CESA was passed in 2018. And at the time, it was responsible for 50% of all online sex work advertising. And so we don't have any good research on this, but in from my point of view, it appears that full service escorting, in-person escorting, you know, the kind of stuff that's usually criminalized as a full-on prostitution charge, has been the bread and butter of every part of the sex work industry since the dawn of time. A lot of people do other parts of sex work, but compared to if you also do some full service, the money does not move nearly as fast, and the full service workers, you know, that's usually big chunk of the income. So for 50% of full service workers working online to lose that access nationwide, not nationwide, sorry, that's 50% of the national market, but it was a worldwide website. So in a lot of places, Backpage would have been the only, one of the only places to advertise. That was a huge deal. So SWOPLA staged a big protest. So did a bunch of other organizations across the country and world, I believe. And we got even more organized and involved and started to, you know, get our leadership figured out, get some organizational status going, figure out how to do some mutual aid projects in a more meaningful scale. And then in 2020, when COVID hit, we launched an emergency relief fund. And so at that point, we had our peer support group, we had our, you know, some potlucks, some fundraisers, very grassrootsy vibes. And we also had our strolls where we do direct outreach to street-based workers. And then but up to then, we, you know, raised a few $1,000s a year, you know, with the fundraiser, passing the hat around, never gave out cash as mutual aid, just did other things. But then the COVID emergency relief fund, we raised about $20,000 that we were able to distribute, which was incredible. And that definitely made us get our financial hats on in a whole new way. And so we then applied to Sex Worker Giving Circle, which is where kind of our first real unrestricted grant that kind of told us like, hey, you know, you guys are doing good work and there might be money available to keep doing this good work because there's a way to get, it was very easy compared to all the other grant applications, but we put together the application, we figured out how to do it, we made it happen, we got the starter funding. And now we have kind of ballooned. And so we now have like 4 times as many peer support groups, including in-person ones and sex worker parent-specific ones. We've got our SWANS program to help people seeking abortions get that abortion, to offer peer navigation and practical support. We're involved in like 6 different research projects of different kinds, including one that's like a big funded kind of public healthy kind of project about how you can run interventions for sex workers in a better way. And we've got our Pro Mom zine and documentary coming out soon and zine produced with a, you know, probably 30 sex workers in a given month doing something SWOPLA related, contributing to some kind of work somehow, which has been absolutely incredible. And so I kind of want to say thank you to Pati and everybody at Third Wave and Sex Worker Giving Circle. And I was also glad to be able to check out for a second because I knew everything Pati was saying about good places to send the money outside of just SWOPLA and Decrim Sex for California, of course, was going to be right on point. So thank you, Pati, and thank you, everyone. And in terms of what you can do, it's been a huge help whenever we have those allies who are willing to like just come into a couple meetings, hear about what's happening, and then offer to help move something forward that otherwise wouldn't have been moved forward, whether it be because of labor or connections or anything like that. I've had some productive partners with academics, especially when they're able to get funding. The big thing that makes, you know, academic work often worth pursuing compared to the other stuff. The big difference maker is the funding that's available, because compared to what you can do with $0, once you start having money on the table, it really expands your possibilities, because sex workers are available for the right price to help contribute to the labor. And so we've been able to do a lot of amazing sex worker-led work, including with the help of Kimberly Soriano, if I can pass to you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley and Pati. I was part of the Sex Worker Giving Circle 2022, I think, 2023 maybe. Yes, 2023, and I had an amazing experience. Also because you get to meet sex worker organizers from around the country. And when you read the applications, you get to learn the different strategies that are going on. And it's just so like powerful. Um, as an organizer, I think it gives you a lot of ideas, a lot of inspiration to see what's possible. And right now, currently, as my position in the Southern California Library, I was really trying to push for, or we're pushing and organizing in-person resource hours specifically catered to street-based workers on Figueroa. Our library is on 62nd and Vermont, and it's been an amazing time to organize ourselves, create plans of action, create structures that have us not relying on police for our own safety. But still, right, having boundaries, having an understanding of what we can do and what we can't in terms of solving the world's issues, right? There's so many intersecting issues that affect sex workers that I think it's really hard to just say like one thing. But I think something that I really learned working in harm reduction around MacArthur Park is that I met so many migrant trans sex workers who also use drugs and couldn't access housing because of the strict, right, no drug use in different types of housing that's specific to trans people. So I think also within our own communities, right, thinking about what how drug use is directly tied to bodily autonomy and sex worker rights, right? Along with that, at the library, we're trying to build tools, right, that are helpful for sex workers and really spaces where people can come and use the restroom, people can come and change, grab some harm reduction supplies, and really get to know, right, folks from SWOPLA and the resources that we are offering. Our collaboration with the library has been very interesting, and I've learned so much. One of the directors of the library, Yusuf Amawali, has been in the community for 20 years and has really seen how South Central has been policed in ways that are directly tied to the policing of sex work and the policing of people who use drugs. And it's usually these programs, right, that are called like weed and seed, where we're gonna weed out the bad stuff and seed in the good stuff, right? And it's usually attacking liquor stores, and it's under this language that's very like anyone can get on board, right? How are you going to argue against things like human trafficking or things like food deserts, right? So it's this like specific weaponization of language. And I think my call would be not to fall for those liberal policies that are very directly trying to kick out certain types of people from the neighborhoods, right? Especially when we see really fast growth through gentrification, through sports development, and also through, I think, I don't know, this might be a spicy take, but also like the over collection of data that happens with sex workers and research, specifically in academia. So as someone who is in academia, right, I think about what happens with the data that we collect that then goes to the university, right? Because the university isn't this uh neutral space. It's tied to statecraft, and it's very invested in what rhetoric and theories we are using, right, for the future. So I think a lot about what data is necessary, right, to do our work. And for me, that is just seeing what do people want at these spaces, right? How are people creating safety within their own communities? And I think something that I cherish a lot from sex worker organizing is understanding that we have the tools that we are that all people, including civies, are going to need heading into this new like fascist millennium, right? Especially unhoused sex workers, especially people who use drugs, right? People who, my mom likes to say callejeras, and she calls me a callejera, which means like you live in the streets, even though you're not, right, unhoused, but you're doing something in the street. And I think being part of these spaces have given me invaluable tools, right, to survive the world. So I think we need to respect sex workers as people who know how to survive, people who know how to navigate, and all these outside of the state, right? Because we can't ask a cop to help us. We can't ask, I don't know, our landlord for help, if anyone even goes to our landlord for help, because we'll be criminalized or we'll be stigmatized. Oftentimes we can't even go to our own families, right? Because we're not out. So thinking about all the navigating that happens when you're a sex worker, especially when you face, right, interpersonal violence, the networks that we create amongst each other, the communities that we create are really, yeah, we're not going to church, right, to ask for these things. So for me, it's always like learn from sex workers, right? But also something very practical for me has been, and I hate to even say this, but it's like not outing people or not assuming that someone's out because of their advertising, or maybe you saw something on their Instagram, right? And you assume that they're out. So it's not outing people. And sometimes, you know, people like to do it for cool points and say like, oh yeah, my best friend's a sex worker, da 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 da. Not tokenizing us and really, right, letting our voices take center stage. That would be my takeaway. Not calling the police. And really imagining different ways of relating to each other, right? Because the moment of state abandonment is already here. At least it is for Indigenous people, for poor people of color. And there's so many valuable tools that we can learn from and use.
Thank you so much, Kim, Ashley, Pati. I really appreciate your words of wisdom and advice for people. And I do also want to highlight, for recording purposes, that there were some links dropped to Third Wave Fund, how to get involved, how to donate, and also SWOPLA, swoplalosangeles.com, how to donate, how to get involved. So please do check out those links. As people were saying, right, you can show up for the people in your life, and that's a way to show support. So hopefully at this point in the conversation, it's pretty clear that people are saying, you know, sex workers are your neighbor, they're your friend, they're your teacher, they're your whoever, right? So, you know, you probably know somebody who is a sex worker, whether they've disclosed that to you or not. And so thinking about sex worker rights as literally the rights that everybody who is alive in the world should have, right? The protection and safety, as Kim was saying, that the state has failed to offer so many precarious groups. How can we achieve that safety for people is by thinking in terms of like this broad range of solidarities that people have mentioned in terms of how we relate to one another and care for one another. So making those connections much more explicit and highlighting the ways, the mechanisms of that violence that the state uses to operate can be a really important launching point to think about how you show up for sex workers that you know, or even people you don't know, right? How we can show up for people. I do recognize we're reaching the end of our time today, so I do want to put it out there. If you have any questions, any comments, like do feel free to throw those in the chat so that we can make sure to address them today. Otherwise, I do want to open the floor to our panelists and ask if they have any concluding thoughts or messages to share with people before we leave the space today.
Just to add on to that last one, and this will do for my concluding message. If you haven't figured it out, it's all political and it's all economic, and politics and economics are intertwined, you know. So in addition to in your daily life and your language and how you're thinking about privacy, keeping in mind that anybody might be a sex worker, that might be private, that's and everybody is, you know, worth making sure that they go to bed with a full belly and a roof over their head if you can help. In addition to that, you know, when you're getting involved politically and when you're getting involved with anything economic and financial, keep in mind the struggle of sex workers and the struggles that sex workers have because of all their other identities, the reasons they have to be struggling right now. Please keep that all in mind. And with all that in mind, consider getting more involved politically, you know, consider getting more informed about the economics that make the politics that you're dealing with in your wherever you got your political power to leverage, whether that's your organization, your local government, thinking about how that economics works out. And yeah, but try to do what you can where you're at. If you don't have a union, maybe get a union. Can always be a good place to start. If you don't have a local jail support team or organization, you know, that's always a good thing to get going.
Thank you so much, Ashley. We do have some questions. So Quinn has asked in the chat, what types of work have you seen done specifically at the intersections of disability justice and sex worker organizing? Would anybody like to speak to that?
I could just say a very practical thing. At the Southern California Library, oftentimes older sex workers who may not identify also as sex workers, but are on the blade, come and just rest or fall asleep on our couches. And really creating spaces like that, right? If you run an office or if you run a nonprofit that has a physical space, right? Creating spaces where people can just exist, especially for people who are oftentimes in the street having to navigate harassment from police, community members, having spaces where, and right, these older sex workers are oftentimes disabled and can't, you know, go all the way home and come back, or don't have enough funds, right, to take a lift or whatever. So I think having physical space where people can just sit and rest and exist has been, right, the most basic thing, but also in our capitalist society and our hate towards unhoused people, it's non-existent, at least in LA, to find spaces where you can just sit down or charge your phone, right? Oftentimes unhoused people are harassed at libraries. So really being intentional, I think, about having a chair outside or anything, right?
Yeah, thank you for sharing the work that the SoCal Library is doing, Kim. And I think that's a really important question and one that has kind of threaded throughout this conversation, which also, if you, in terms of also supporting sex workers, you know, read what people are writing, read the words, you know, from people. So Trislink, oh, and Kim dropped the website link to SoCal Library, so you can check out them as well. Trislink has a blog that sex workers can write for, and a lot of people have talked about the intersection between sex work and disability justice. And it's a really fruitful place to start since it's people sharing their lived experience. But yeah, thank you for that question. And also thank you, shout out to Lord in the chat as well. I think we appreciate the optimistic reading because it's definitely not easy to always be optimistic, especially on days like this. I'll put the link in the chat for you, but did others have any parting words as we wrap up today?
I just wanted to name in response to that comment that we're non-male sex workers, and there's probably a further degree of isolation and maybe therefore less optimism amongst male sex workers even in our organization. Like SWOPLA is pretty big, and we only have like 1 or 2 men or masks for every, you know, 9 or 10 femmes and women. So there's a slightly different cultural phenomenon with identifying as a sex worker as a man and being able to kind of communicate with other male sex workers. There's more barriers there for a few reasons, and that's definitely a struggle we see here as well. But also, we keep fighting because we believe, so that's why we're still here, I think.
Right. So if there are no more questions or comments, Pati, did you want to share?
Just wanted to say thank you for having us. Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you all for being here and for sharing so much of your knowledge, and I appreciate the generosity in being here today. And I do want to, as we wrap up and as we finish, again, to highlight the fact that, sex workers are targeted by state violence. We lose our lives to state violence, and that impacts us. Some of us are calling in from Tongvaland, some of us are in other parts of the United States. And there are people, in our, quote unquote, in our backyard who have died from police violence for being a sex worker. So I do want to make space to honor those and provide some recognition of their names. We have a list of people that the SWOP USA collects every year. I won't post it in the chat, but I will just say, like, there are, as much as records can be dangerous, which Kim has highlighted, there are physical remembrance of the lives of people lost. And Kim has also shared some of those people who are in Los Angeles, like Irene Gonzalez, Meraxes Medina, Kendra Rush, Essence Jackson, Nayani Finlayson, Ricardo Ramirez Jr., and Irene Gonzalez, all killed within the last year or two through LAPD violence and through the violence of others. So I hope there's some recognition of the seriousness and the gravity of this topic, but also, as people have highlighted, the hope and the potential to combat it, to build something better. Okay, thank you all for being here. Again, please let me know if you have any last thoughts. Otherwise, we can kind of wrap up for today and hopefully do more D17 mornings celebrating. Feel free to donate your money to sex worker organizers and also to any kind of sex worker events. Please attend them. Thank you. There's also a SWOPLA supply drive today for D17. So please check that out on Instagram. Check out Third Wave Fund on Instagram. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Hopefully we can be in touch in the future.